The river went quiet the night before it happened. Not the ordinary quiet that settles over the Amazon at the deepest hour, when even the frogs go still and the air holds its breath before dawn. This was something else entirely. A vacancy. The kind of silence that does not occur naturally in that forest, because that forest is never silent. Not once in 11 years of working the Juruá Basin had I encountered a corridor of that river that was completely without sound. But that night it went silent. And I lay in my hammock and stared up at the darkness above the palm leaf canopy and thought nothing of it. That was the greatest mistake of my life. My name is Arnaldo Ferreira. I was born in Manaus in 1895. I spent the better part of my adult life as a professional hunter and meat supplier for the rubber trading settlements along the upper Juruá River in the state of Amazonas. I am telling this now because I am 81 years old and will not live to see another dry season, and because there is a young man who has been visiting me and asking me to explain what happened to the camp at Igarapé Preto in August of 1931. He says he found a report I filed with the trading post director at Igarapé. He says the report mentions a creature that does not exist. He wants me to explain it. I will explain it. I will explain all of it. But I want to say first that I have spent 50 years telling myself there is a rational explanation that fits inside the world as I understood it. A tapir of extraordinary size, a black bear that wandered south from territory no one had mapped, something I did not see clearly in the dark and the smoke and the confusion of that night. I spent 50 years building that argument. I want to be honest with you now. It does not hold. I saw what I saw, and what I saw was not a tapir. Let me tell you about the camp. We had been working the Igarapé Preto territory for 3 dry seasons by 1931. The Igarapé is a blackwater tributary that feeds into the Juruá from the south, cutting through a section of forest so dense and elevated that even during flood season, the ground stays above water. That is unusual for that region. Most of the forest floor along the Juruá spends 4 months of the year under 2 meters of water. But the Igarapé Preto section sits on a long ridge of ancient dark soil, and the trees there are older than anything I had seen elsewhere in 30 years of working the basin. Sabre trees with trunks 6 meters across. Brazil nut trees so tall their crowns disappeared into a second canopy layer above the first. The surface roots of those trees ran along the ground for 20 and 30 meters before diving back underground, creating a landscape of arched corridors and shadowed chambers at ground level that made the place feel like the interior of a structure built by something that had never heard of architecture. It was extraordinary country for hunting. Peccary in large numbers, tapir along the creek margins, caiman in the side pools. White-lipped deer in the clearings where old trees had fallen and light came down to the ground. The trading post at Igarapé paid well for fresh meat, and we had 4 canoes and 12 men and a camp that had been built up over 3 seasons into something nearly comfortable by jungle standards. We had sleeping platforms raised off the ground, a covered kitchen area with a clay oven, a smokehouse for preserving meat before the canoe runs to the trading post, and a dock constructed from split palm trunks where we could tie the canoes and load cargo. It was a working settlement, not elaborate, but solid and organized, and well supplied. We had operated it without serious incident through 2 complete dry seasons and were 3 weeks into the 3rd. I want to tell you about the guides before I tell you what happened. It is important. We worked with 4 Matses men from a community about 2 days upriver by canoe. I had known the senior guide, a man named Kahui, for 8 years. He was a serious and capable man who spoke functional Portuguese and who had taught me more about that forest than I had learned in all my years before meeting him. Kahui knew the Igarapé Preto territory as well as any man alive. He had grown up in the forest to the south of it and had hunted the ridge for most of his adult life. He was not a man given to superstition or to unnecessary alarm. When something was dangerous, he named it plainly and explained what to do about it. He was, in the way I use the word, a professional. On the morning of August the 4th, 1931, Kahui came to me at the dock before the work started and told me he and the other 3 guides were leaving. He said this without drama. He stood at the edge of the dock and looked at the water and told me in his flat, direct way that they would be returning to their community and that we should break camp and follow them out before the following morning. I asked him why. He said that something was wrong with the forest to the south. I asked him what specifically was wrong. He said the forest was occupied. I asked him what that meant. He looked at me for a long time without answering. Then he said the word for ape in his language. Not the word for a small primate, the word for something else. Something I had heard mentioned once before by an older man in his community, spoken in the context of a story I had taken to be symbolic, a story about a time before this time when the forest had different tenants. I asked him if he meant a spider monkey. He looked at me the way a patient man looks at a person who has not understood a simple thing. Then he said the word again. Then he turned and walked to where his 3 companions were already loading their packs into their canoe. I watched them paddle out onto the main river and disappear around the bend to the north. I stood at the dock and watched the water close behind their canoe, and I told myself that Kahui was a good guide and a reasonable man, but that the jungle produces strange fears in even the most experienced men, and that we had work to do and a contract to fulfill. I told myself this with considerable confidence. I told 5 of my men the same thing in general terms. They accepted it because I was the leader and because none of them had heard what Kahui had said in any detail. I had not translated the full conversation for them. I told them the guides had a family matter to attend to upriver. That was the second mistake. The first 2 days after the guides left were without incident. We continued hunting along the eastern trails, well away from the ridge interior, where Kahui had been increasingly reluctant to take us for the previous 4 days. And we brought in a good quantity of peccary and 1 large tapir that gave us nearly 300 kilograms of meat for the smokehouse. The weather was dry and hot, and the sky above the canopy was a narrow blue strip between the trees. The forest around the camp felt entirely normal. Birds called in the morning. Monkeys moved through the upper canopy in the afternoon, following their usual routes. Caiman floated in the black pools along the Igarapé margin with the stillness of logs. Everything was as it should have been. Then on the second night, the sounds began. I should explain something about sound in that forest, because it matters to understanding what I heard. The Amazon canopy at night is one of the loudest natural environments on the planet. The frogs alone produce a sound like continuous rainfall, even on a completely dry night. Tree crickets add a pitched constant tone that sits above the frog chorus like a second layer. Owls call from the understory. Nightjars produce a rhythmic percussive sound from the lower branches. Caiman occasionally produce a deep, vibrating call that seems to come from the water itself. And through and beneath all of this, the forest is in continuous physical motion. Branches fall, dead wood shifts, animals move through the undergrowth at all hours. A professional hunter learns to hear through all of this, to filter it, to identify the sound of a single peccary moving through leaf litter at 40 meters against the background of everything else. You develop a kind of catalogue. You learn what the forest says in its normal voice. You know immediately when it says something else. What I heard on the night of August the 6th did not belong in that catalogue. I was asleep on my platform when the sound woke me. I do not know exactly what time it was. Late, because the frog chorus had reached its peak volume, which happens somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. The sound that woke me was a single impact. A deep, resonant impact that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. Like something very large striking the ground from a height. I sat up and listened. The frogs were still calling. The insects were still calling. I sat still for perhaps 2 minutes, heard nothing further, and lay back down. 2 hours later, the canopy above the camp moved. I was awake again without knowing why. I lay on my back and looked up at the palm leaf roof of my sleeping platform, and I heard the canopy moving. Not the light movement that comes from wind, which would have moved the entire canopy together in a sweeping, progressive sound. This was localized. A section of canopy, perhaps 30 meters east of the camp, moving in a way that suggested large weight shifting from one point to another. I could hear individual branches bending and then springing back. I could hear the creak of large limbs under a load. I could hear the interval between each movement, irregular, but with a rhythm to it that suggested something traveling rather than something falling or being blown. I got up. I took my rifle and my lantern, and I stood outside my sleeping platform and held the lantern up and looked into the dark between the trees. The lantern throws a yellow circle of about 8 meters in the forest at night. Beyond that circle, the darkness is absolute. I could hear the canopy still moving, the sound tracking from east to slightly north, and then it stopped. I stood and listened for a very long time. Nothing further. The frogs called. The insects called. I went back to my platform. In the morning, I said nothing to the men. On the morning of August the 7th, Joachim, who was one of my most experienced hunters, came to me at the kitchen fire and told me he had found tracks. He had gone to check the snare lines along the eastern tributary before breakfast and had found them empty. Not tripped, not robbed, empty, with the ground around them disturbed. He said the disturbed ground was extensive. He said the tracks in it were not made by any animal he knew. I asked him to show me. We walked to the eastern snare line together. The line ran along a low section of trail about 400 meters from camp, following the edge of a raised root system where small animals regularly traveled. All 12 snares had been emptied of their catches. Around several of them, the ground showed clear evidence of something large having stood very close to the snare positions. The soft earth held impressions. I looked at those impressions for a long time without speaking. They were roughly circular. Each was approximately half a meter across. The depth was extraordinary, several centimeters into soil that was not particularly soft. The pattern was irregular but unmistakable as a walking gait, and the stride between each impression was longer than anything I could account for with any known animal. I measured the stride with my own steps. 4.5 of my steps between each impression. I am not a small man. I stood at the edge of those prints and I looked into the forest beyond the snare line, and I thought about what Kahui had said. Then I thought about what Kahui had said again. I told Joachim the tracks were from a large tapir that had been moving strangely, perhaps injured. He accepted this without enthusiasm. He looked at the tracks and then looked at me and said nothing further. We returned to camp. That evening I walked the perimeter of the camp myself. I did not tell the men I was doing this. I told them I was checking the smokehouse drainage. I walked the entire perimeter of our camp clearing, approximately 120 meters in circumference, moving through the forest margin where the cleared area met the tree line. On the eastern and southeastern sections, at intervals of roughly 15 meters, I found more impressions in the soft ground. They followed the outer edge of the camp in a clear pattern. Something had walked the full perimeter of our camp during the previous night. It had walked it slowly, at intervals that suggested pausing and standing in place. At 3 points along the perimeter, I found spots where the ground was compressed over an area larger than a single footprint, as if something had stood still long enough to settle its full weight without shifting. I stood at the last of these spots and looked at the camp from the outside, from the perspective of something standing in the tree line. I could see the glow of the cook fire. I could see the shapes of the sleeping platforms. I could see Joachim sitting by the fire cleaning his rifle. I went back to camp and I sharpened my machete and I loaded both rifles and placed them where I could reach them without rising. The night of August the 7th was the last quiet night. I do not mean that terrible things happened on August the 7th. Nothing overtly alarming occurred. The men ate and talked and cleaned equipment and went to their platforms. The cook fire burned down. The forest settled into its night voice, but I lay awake for most of that night listening, and what I noticed was an absence I could not fully account for. The frogs along the Igarapé margin, which normally called in a continuous overlapping chorus for the entire night, stopped calling around the second hour of darkness, not gradually, all at once, as if something had passed over the water and extinguished them. I heard the canopy movement again, further west this time, and lower. Not the high canopy above 50 meters, but something in the middle canopy, the layer between 20 and 35 meters. The sounds were heavier than 2 nights before. The interval between movements was shorter. Something was getting comfortable with the distance. I held my rifle, and I did not sleep. In the morning of August, the 8th, 3 of the men came to me separately before breakfast, and each told me they had heard something in the forest overnight. Louise, who slept on the south side of camp, said he had heard breathing. He described it as very deep and very slow and very close, just beyond the edge of the cleared area. I asked him how close. He pointed to a spot perhaps 6 meters from where we were standing. Manuel said he had heard something dragging along the outside of the smokehouse wall, a slow, scraping sound, about an hour after midnight. Paolo said that when he got up before dawn, he had seen a shape at the edge of the tree line on the north side of camp. He could not describe it clearly. He said it was tall. He said it was not a tree because trees do not move. I called the men together after breakfast. I told them that a large animal had been investigating the camp and that until we had dealt with it, we should post a night watch, 2 men at a time, rotating through the night. I chose not to tell them what I thought it was. I still could not tell them because I had not yet fully accepted it myself. Instead, I spoke about jaguars. I said a large jaguar had been drawn by the smell of the smokehouse and that we needed to be watchful and armed. The men accepted this with visible relief. They had been frightened by the sounds of the previous nights and had been looking for an explanation that fit inside the world they knew. I gave them one that did. The watch began that night. I took the first watch myself, with Joachim. We sat at the kitchen table with a lantern burning low and our rifles across our knees, and we talked quietly about nothing of consequence, the way men do when they are keeping watch and do not want to think about what they are watching for. The forest around the camp was normal for the first part of the night. The frogs called, the insects called. An owl passed over the camp twice. Then, shortly before the 3rd hour of darkness, the frogs stopped again. The same abrupt silence as the night before, but this time it spread further. Not just along the Igarapé, but all around the camp in every direction. The insect sound continued for a few minutes after the frogs stopped, and then it too diminished and then ceased. Within perhaps 10 minutes of the frogs going silent, the camp clearing was surrounded by a silence I can only describe as pressurized, as if the air itself had been compressed inward. Joachim looked at me and I looked at him, and neither of us spoke. Then we heard footsteps. Not in the canopy, on the ground, coming from the south, from the direction of the ridge interior where Kahui had refused to take us. The footsteps were slow and widely spaced, and each one produced the same deep, resonant impact I had heard on the first night, felt in the chest before it registered in the ears. I counted the footsteps. They stopped at approximately 40 meters south of the camp perimeter. I could see nothing. The lantern reached 8 meters. Beyond that was a wall of darkness. Joachim had his rifle raised. I put my hand on his arm and pressed it down. I did not want a shot fired in the dark at something I could not see and could not identify, with 5 sleeping men in the line of fire. We sat still and we listened. Whatever had stopped outside the camp stood there for a very long time. I measured it in breaths. Long, slow breaths, the way you breathe when you are trying not to make sound and your body is fighting you. Joachim and I did not speak. We did not move. The thing in the darkness beyond the camp did not move. The silence was total. I became acutely aware of the weight of my rifle across my knees, of the texture of the table surface under my hands, of the slow heat of the lantern glass beside me. I became aware of my own heartbeat. It was very loud. Then the footsteps resumed, moving east along the south perimeter, each step at exactly the same slow, heavy pace as before. Moving along the outside of the camp, the way a man walks the boundary of his own property. I tracked the sound with my eyes, swinging the lantern slowly toward where I estimated the footsteps were. I saw nothing. The footsteps continued east, then turned north, then faded as they moved further into the eastern forest. We sat at that table until dawn without speaking and without sleeping. In the morning I made a decision. I told the men we would load the canoes with the preserved meat in the smokehouse and depart for the trading post the following day. I said we had filled our quota and there was no reason to extend our stay. This was not true. We were short of our target by a significant amount. 2 men questioned the timeline, and I told them the decision about departure was mine and that we would leave in the morning. I spoke firmly enough that the questions stopped. Then I went to the south perimeter of the camp and followed the tree line east, looking for where the thing had passed. I found the ground impressions within 20 meters of the camp edge. The impressions on the south perimeter were deeper than any I had found before. The stride was the same measured distance, but the impressions themselves were larger than those I had measured at the snare line. I looked at them for a long time and then I walked back to camp without measuring them. The day of August the 9th passed without incident. The men worked the smokehouse and packed the meat crates and checked the canoes and tied the cargo for departure. The mood was cooperative and even slightly festive, the way it is when a camp is breaking up after a long stint and everyone is ready to see a town again. I moved through the work with them and said nothing about what Joachim and I had heard and seen. Joachim himself said nothing to the others, which I was grateful for. He was a man who understood when silence was the appropriate response to a situation. That night was August the 9th. We had the watch running again. I took the middle watch, from the 3rd hour of darkness to the 5th. The first watch passed without incident according to the 2 men who ran it, though both reported the usual silence that had settled over the camp during the previous nights. By the time I took over at the 3rd hour, the forest was completely silent again, total silence, the kind that now felt like a signal I had learned to read. I sat at the kitchen table with Rodrigo, who was young and not experienced enough to be frightened in a useful way. He was nervous in the way young men are nervous, alert and talkative, and I had to quiet him twice in the first half hour because his talking was covering the sounds I needed to hear. The canopy moved at the beginning of the 4th hour, not to the east, to the south and directly above. High canopy, above 50 meters, a sound like heavy, irregular percussion moving toward the camp from the ridge. I stood up. I told Rodrigo to wake the other men. He looked at me and asked why. I told him to wake them now. He got up from the table and went toward the sleeping platforms. I stood at the kitchen table with my lantern in one hand and my rifle in the other, and I tracked the canopy sound as it moved from south toward the camp, directly overhead. It was moving faster now than it had been on any of the previous nights. The intervals between impacts were shorter. Whatever it was no longer traveling at the slow, exploratory pace I had been tracking. It was moving with purpose. The canopy sound stopped directly above the camp. In the complete silence that followed, I heard the breathing for the first time in this way. Not the distant, deep respiration Louise had described from the south perimeter 2 nights before. This was directly above me. 5 meters above me. 10 meters, perhaps. Deep, slow, controlled, breathing from something I could not see in the darkness above the palm fronds of the kitchen shelter. I raised the lantern. Its light reached perhaps 3 meters into the canopy above me. I could see nothing but the underside of the shelter roof and the darkness above it. Then the roof came down. Not gradually. It came down in a single catastrophic collapse, as if the entire structure had been gripped from above and pulled inward. I threw myself backward from the table and landed on my back in the dirt, and the lantern flew from my hand and struck the ground, and its flame went out, and I was in total darkness. I heard the crash of the shelter collapsing around me, palm fronds and lashed poles and the clay oven and all the contents of the kitchen hitting the ground in every direction. I heard something very large landing in the space where I had been standing a half-second before. The impact when it landed shook the ground beneath me. I felt it in the ground, through my back, through my shoulders, through the back of my skull. I could not see anything. I was on my back in total darkness with my rifle still in my right hand, and I could hear something moving in the wreckage of the kitchen shelter, sorting through the debris with a sound I cannot properly describe. A kind of methodical displacement of heavy material. And I could hear the breathing, still slow and deep and deliberate, and it was close enough that I could feel the displaced air when it exhaled. A warm movement of air in the darkness directly above me. I heard the men shouting from the direction of the sleeping platforms. I heard the sleeping platforms collapsing as men threw themselves off them. I heard Rodrigo screaming. I heard footsteps running, and the crash of men moving through undergrowth in the dark without lanterns, running blind through the forest toward the sound of water. I rolled to my left and got to my feet, and I ran. I ran toward the dock, and I heard behind me, in the camp, a sound like wood splitting along its grain. Then, another impact that shook the ground through my feet, even as I was running. Then a long, slow sound like the smokehouse wall coming apart at its joints, a structured collapse, each component failing in sequence. As if something were simply walking through the camp and the structures were dissolving under its passage without any particular effort. I reached the dock, and I could hear men in the water below me, and I called names into the darkness, and voices answered from the river. I counted responses. 5 voices. 6. Including mine. I called again. 7, with Joaquim answering from somewhere downriver, where he had apparently been swimming. I called the last name. Louise. No answer. I called again. Nothing. I stood on the dock with my rifle, and I looked back toward the camp, and the camp was dark. No lantern. No cook fire. Just the darkness of the forest, and somewhere in it, the sound of things being moved. A slow, deliberate sound. Not destruction, precisely. More a sound of investigation. Something moving through the wreckage of what we had built, and examining the debris of our settlement. Then silence. The frogs began calling again. Then the insects. Within minutes, the forest had resumed its full night voice as if nothing had happened. I stood on the dock for a long time. We found Louise at dawn. He was clinging to a root mass 30 meters downriver, unhurt but in a condition I do not have clinical words for. He had been in the water since before the attack and had heard the camp collapsing from the river. He had not come out of the water for the duration of the night. He did not speak for 2 days. We loaded the undamaged canoe, the one tied at the far end of the dock, with whatever we could retrieve from the camp in the first hour of daylight. We did not go back for more than 1 hour. In that hour I saw what had been done. Both sleeping platforms were collapsed. The smokehouse wall had been pushed inward and the roof had come down. The kitchen shelter was entirely flat. The second canoe had been pushed off its tie and we found it downstream against a root mass. The clay oven had been moved, not demolished. It sat 15 meters from where we had built it, in a relatively intact condition, displaced as if something had simply picked it up and set it down elsewhere. I looked at the ground in the camp clearing before we left. The impressions in the soft earth near the center of the camp were the largest I encountered across the entire 4 days of this account. I will not give you a number for their size, because when I give people numbers, they look at me in a particular way that ends conversations. I will tell you that they were not made by a tapir, and not made by a jaguar, and not made by any animal that appears in any naturalist's catalogue that I have read in 50 years of occasionally looking for such a catalogue. We paddled out on the main river by mid-morning and reached the trading post at Igarapé 2 days later. I wrote a report for the director, a man named Costa, and he read it with the expression of a man reading something he finds professionally embarrassing. He filed it. I learned later that he wrote a note in the margin suggesting mechanical factors for the camp collapse. High wind loading on improperly braced structures. There was no wind that night, not a breath of it. I went back to hunting after a few months. I worked the Juruá Basin for another 12 years. I never returned to the Igarapé Preto territory. When the route south required me to pass the mouth of the Igarapé, I sat in the bow of the canoe and looked at the water entering the main river, and then I looked forward, and I kept my eyes forward after that. Kahui and I worked together again on 2 subsequent contracts, both far to the north of that territory. He never mentioned what had happened at the camp. I never asked. There was a kind of agreement in our silence that felt like the only reasonable response to the thing we both knew about. We worked well together. He remained competent and steady. We did not speak of the Igarapé. I do not know what it was. I have spent 50 years constructing and then dismantling explanations that do not hold. I am 81 years old, and I am not afraid of the dark, and I am not a man given to dramatizing things that happened to him. I am telling you what I observed. The forest has tenants older than any census I know of. Some of them object to human settlement on their territory. The one that visited our camp on the night of August the 9th, 1931, objected very deliberately and very comprehensively, and it made its objection in a physical language that required no translation. I have not slept without hearing it since that night, not once in 45 years, every night, without exception, the same slow, deep breathing in the darkness just above me. Every morning I wake and I am in my own bed in Manaus, and the ceiling above me is plaster, and the street outside is beginning to move, and I lie still for a moment and I think it through carefully. I am in Manaus. I am in my own bed. It is 1976. I am safe. Then I close my eyes and I hear it exhale above me in the darkness, and I do not sleep anymore that night.